Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Viktor Frankl. The year was 1937, and the cobblestones of Vienna's Berggasse still echoed with the footsteps of intellectual giants. In a modest clinic not far from Freud's famous consulting room, a young neurologist named Viktor Emil Frankl bent over his desk, the scratch of his fountain pen cutting through the autumn silence. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe, mixing with the crisp smell of fallen leaves that carpeted the streets of Austria's cultural capital. At 32, Frankl possessed an intensity that struck his colleagues, dark eyes that seemed to peer beyond the surface of human suffering, seeking something deeper than symptoms. His patients spoke of a doctor who didn't just listen to their words, but somehow heard the unspoken yearning beneath their despair. The leather chair in his office had absorbed countless confessions, tears, and breakthrough moments as Frankl developed what would become his revolutionary approach to healing the human soul. The warmth of the clinic's radiator contrasted sharply with the growing chill outside, not just of the approaching winter, but of something far more ominous. Political rallies had begun echoing through Vienna's grand boulevards, their harsh voices bouncing off Baroque facades that had witnessed centuries of human drama. Frankl could feel the city's pulse quickening, its rhythm becoming irregular, dangerous. In the evenings, he would retreat to his small apartment, where manuscript pages covered his dining table like fallen snow. At candlelight, he worked on what he believed would be his life's work, a comprehensive exploration of humanity's fundamental drive, not for pleasure, as Freud suggested, nor for power, as Adler claimed, but for meaning. The paper felt rough beneath his fingertips as he wrote, each word carefully chosen, each concept meticulously crafted. His theory was taking shape, logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning meaning itself. Frankl observed that his patients' deepest suffering often stemmed not from external circumstances, but from an inner emptiness, what he called an existential vacuum. He watched as men and women, successful by every measure, sat before him hollow-eyed, describing lives that felt purposeless despite their achievements. The leather chair in his office had absorbed countless confessions, tears, and breakthrough moments as Frankl developed what would become his revolutionary approach to healing the human soul. The warmth of the clinic's radiator contrasted sharply with the growing chill outside, not just of the approaching winter, but of something far more ominous. Political rallies had begun echoing through Vienna's grand boulevards, their harsh voices displaying broken windows like wounded eyes. Friends whispered of emigration plans over hurried dinners, their conversations peppered with nervous glances toward drawn curtains. Frankl felt the weight of choice pressing upon him like a physical force. Colleagues urged him to flee while escape remained possible. His manuscript represented years of painstaking work, insights that could revolutionize how humanity understood suffering and resilience. But something deeper anchored him to this place, to these people who needed healing more than ever. In his final patient notes of 1937, Frankl wrote observations that would prove prophetic. He described how individuals facing seemingly impossible circumstances could transcend their suffering by finding meaning within it. He didn't yet know that he would soon test this theory under conditions more brutal than any human should endure. The manuscript pages rustled in the evening breeze from his open window, carrying with them the distant sound of church bells, a sound that would soon be replaced by sirens, shouts, and the terrible silence that follows when civilization begins to crumble. As winter approached, Viktor Frankl continued his work, unaware that he was about to lose everything he had ever created, everyone he had ever loved, and nearly his own life. But what came next would either destroy his theories entirely or forge them in the fires of ultimate testing. The best is yet to come.
The cattle car's metal floor burned cold against Viktor Frankl's cheek as the train lurched through the Austrian countryside. September 1942. The stench of fear and unwashed bodies pressed against him from all sides, a suffocating blanket of human desperation. Through gaps in the wooden slats, glimpses of familiar landscapes flickered past. Fields where he had once walked with his wife Tilly, discussing their dreams of building a family, of growing old together in the Vienna they both loved. His manuscript was gone. 3 years of meticulous research, his life's theoretical work on meaning and purpose, had been reduced to ash in a Nazi furnace. But in those final moments before deportation, Frankl had made a decision that would define everything that followed. He had memorized key passages, burning his ideas into memory where no SS officer could reach them. The train's rhythm became a metronome of loss. Clack, clack, Tilly's wedding ring, gone. Clack, clack, his medical practice, vanished. Clack, clack, his parents, his brother, separated, destinations unknown. The sound drilled into his skull as Vienna disappeared behind them, taking with it every external marker of who Viktor Frankl had been. Theresienstadt concentration camp materialized through morning mist like a vision from hell's antechamber. The smell hit first, a cocktail of human waste, rotting food, and something else that would take weeks to identify. The scent of hope dying. Barbed wire caught the pale sunlight, casting geometric shadows across the camp's entrance where prisoners stumbled forward in lines, their faces already learning the blank expression of survival. Within hours, Frankl's world compressed to the dimensions of survival. The wooden bunk where he slept felt like ice against his spine, shared with 5 other men whose names he forced himself to remember, because forgetting their humanity meant forgetting his own. The daily ration of thin soup arrived warm, but tasted of nothing. Its watery consistency, a mockery of nourishment that his stomach received with desperate gratitude. In the medical barracks, where prisoners were permitted to tend to basic health needs, Frankl discovered something extraordinary happening. Stripped of everything external, possessions, status, even names replaced by numbers, his fellow prisoners revealed who they truly were. Some collapsed into despair, their spirits breaking faster than their bodies. Others, however, seemed to find an inner strength that transcended their circumstances. Dr. Frankl began to recognize the pattern he had theorized about in his warm Vienna clinic. Prisoners who had found meaning in their suffering, whether through caring for others, maintaining dignity, or holding on to a purpose beyond the camp, these individuals endured with a resilience that defied logic. They shared their meager bread rations with weaker prisoners. They whispered words of comfort to those breaking down. They maintained their humanity when everything around them demanded its surrender. The winter of 1942 tested every theory Frankl had ever developed about human nature. Ice formed inside their barracks, creating crystals that caught what little light filtered through dirty windows. His hands, once steady enough to perform delicate neurological examinations, now trembled constantly from cold and malnutrition. The skin stretched taut across his cheekbones, transforming his reflection into a stranger's face. Yet in the darkest moments, Frankl began reconstructing his manuscript in his mind. Not the academic version he had lost, but something deeper, insights forged in the crucible of ultimate testing. He observed how prisoners who focused solely on their suffering became consumed by it, while those who found meaning in spite of their suffering discovered an unbreakable inner freedom. During the endless roll calls, standing in formation as guards counted and recounted their human inventory, Frankl would close his eyes and lecture to imaginary students. He delivered presentations on logotherapy to audiences that existed only in his memory, developing concepts that would one day revolutionize psychology. The bitter wind that cut through his thin uniform became the backdrop for breakthrough insights about human resilience. The sound of wooden clogs against frozen ground created a rhythm that hundreds of prisoners moved to each day, their synchronized footsteps echoing off barracks walls. But for Frankl, that rhythm began to represent something else entirely, the heartbeat of a theory being born through unimaginable testing. As 1943 approached, rumors spread through the camp like fever. Whispers of trains heading east, of camps where people disappeared entirely. The taste of fear became as familiar as the daily ration of ersatz coffee that burned their throats each morning. Some prisoners spoke of escape attempts, others of resistance. But Frankl was discovering a third path, one that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about human suffering and strength. He didn't know that his greatest test was still ahead, waiting in a place where his theory would either shatter completely or emerge as one of humanity's most powerful tools for transcendence.
The train to Auschwitz moved differently than the one to Theresienstadt. This time, the silence felt absolute, a void that swallowed even the sound of breathing. October 1944. Through the slats, Viktor Frankl caught glimpses of a landscape that seemed drained of color, as if the earth itself had surrendered to despair. The metallic taste of fear coated his mouth as the wheels carried them toward a name that had become synonymous with humanity's darkest capability. The selection platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau stretched before them like a stage set for the final act of civilization. SS officers moved with casual efficiency, their polished boots reflecting the harsh overhead lights as they gestured left or right with gloved hands. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, not the comforting smoke of hearth fires, but something acrid that burned the throat and stung the eyes with recognition too terrible to acknowledge. Frankl watched as his life divided into two lines. To the right, those deemed useful for labor. To the left, a path that ended in smoke. The officer's finger pointed right, and Frankl stumbled forward, his legs barely supporting him. But as he moved, he heard a sound that would haunt him forever. His father's voice calling his name from the other line. The moment stretched like eternity. Their eyes met across 10 meters that might as well have been 10,000 miles. His father's face, aged beyond his 73 years, carried an expression of profound calm. No words were exchanged, but Frankl understood. In that instant, he witnessed what he would later identify as the ultimate expression of human dignity, the choice to face death with meaning intact. The barracks at Auschwitz-Birkenau felt different from Theresienstadt. Here, the wooden bunks seemed to absorb hope itself, their surfaces worn smooth by the bodies of countless prisoners who had passed through this antechamber of oblivion. The straw mattresses crackled with each movement, a sound that became the soundtrack to nightmares, both sleeping and waking. Thank you for staying with me until this point. Your attention honors the weight of this story. Winter arrived early that year, turning the camp into a frozen wasteland where survival measured itself in heartbeats. Frankl's hands, once skilled at delicate surgical procedures, now bore the cracks and sores of forced labor. His body weight dropped to levels that defied medical understanding of human endurance. Yet something inexplicable was happening in his mind, a crystallization of purpose that grew stronger as his physical form weakened. During the pre-dawn roll calls, standing in formation while guards counted their diminishing numbers, Frankl began to experience visions that would reshape his understanding of human consciousness.
He saw himself in a warm, well-lit hall, delivering a presentation to distinguished colleagues about the psychological observations he was making in real time. The vision felt more real than the frozen ground beneath his feet, more substantial than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. In these moments of transcendence, Frankl discovered what would become the cornerstone of his life's work. Even in the most dehumanizing circumstances imaginable, human beings retain the freedom to choose their response. They could not choose their circumstances, but they could choose their stance toward those circumstances. This insight arrived not as intellectual theory, but as lived experience carved into his consciousness by unthinkable suffering. The death of his father became a laboratory for testing this revelation. Grief threatened to consume him entirely, a black hole of loss that could have sucked away his remaining will to live. Instead, Frankl made a conscious decision to honor his father's memory through meaning. Every day he survived would be a testament to the dignity his father had displayed in his final moments. Every insight he gained would become part of a legacy that death could not touch. In the medical block, where he was occasionally permitted to help with basic prisoner care, Frankl observed phenomena that medical school had never prepared him for. Prisoners who had found something to live for, a child waiting at home, an unfinished book, a promise to keep. These individuals displayed a resilience that defied every biological prediction. Their bodies were starving, but their spirits had found nourishment in purpose itself. Others, despite being physically stronger, would collapse seemingly overnight. The light in their eyes would simply extinguish, as if an internal switch had been thrown. Frankl began to understand that the human spirit, like the human body, required sustenance, but its food was meaning, not bread. As winter deepened, Frankl's manuscript began to reconstitute itself in his mind with startling clarity. Not the academic version he had lost in Vienna, but something forged in the furnace of ultimate testing. Each observation, each moment of transcendence, each choice to find meaning in suffering became part of a theoretical framework that was writing itself in real time. The sound of liberation seemed impossible, too distant to contemplate. Yet Frankl was already composing his testimony, crafting the words that would help humanity understand what he was learning in this place where learning should have been impossible. He was discovering that meaning could not only survive the worst that humans could inflict on each other, it could actually be strengthened by it. But his greatest revelation was still ahead, waiting in the moments when the human spirit would reveal its most extraordinary capacity for transformation.
The American soldiers appeared like figures from a half-remembered dream. April 27, 1945. Their olive-green uniforms seemed impossibly clean against the wasteland that Turkheim concentration camp had become. The sound of their boots on frozen ground carried a different rhythm, not the harsh percussion of oppression, but something that resonated with hope. Viktor Frankl, weighing barely 90 pounds, watched through eyes that had forgotten how to process the concept of liberation. Freedom arrived not as celebration, but as disorientation. The absence of barbed wire felt like phantom pain, as if his nervous system still expected electric shock from barriers that were no longer there. The first warm meal, real bread, actual soup with substance, sent his shrunken stomach into rebellion. His body had adapted so completely to deprivation that abundance felt like assault. But it was the silence that proved most unsettling. No morning roll call,
No guards shouting commands. No systematic dehumanization measuring out the minutes of each day. In the vacuum left by suffering's departure, Frankl discovered something profound. He was not the same man who had boarded that cattle car in Vienna 3 years earlier. The question now became, who had he become? The journey back to Vienna unfolded like archaeology in reverse, each familiar landmark revealing layers of loss. The Danube still flowed with the same blue-gray waters, but the bridges crossing it now spanned more than river. They connected a world that had been to one that could never be again. The smell of coffee drifted from reopening cafes, but it carried undertones of absence, of voices that would never again join the city's conversations. His apartment stood empty, of course. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows he had once looked out of with entirely different eyes. The rooms felt simultaneously too large and too small, like clothes that no longer fit a body transformed by experience. But in the silence, Frankl heard something extraordinary. The voice of his reconstructed manuscript calling to him with urgent clarity. The typewriter keys felt foreign under his fingers at first, their mechanical precision a stark contrast to the organic rhythms of survival he had learned. But as he began to type, muscle memory merged with spiritual necessity. The words that emerged were not academic theories he had lost, but something forged in fire, insights that could only have been born from the marriage of suffering and meaning. Man's search for meaning began as an act of testimony, but evolved into something far more powerful. Each page carried the weight of witnessed truth, observations made when observation itself was an act of resistance. Frankl wrote of prisoners who had transcended their circumstances not by denying their suffering, but by discovering purpose within it. He documented the moment when meaning became more powerful than circumstance, when the why of existence overpowered any how much one could endure. The manuscript grew like a living thing, fed by memories that had been preserved in the most unlikely archive, a human mind that had chosen remembrance over surrender. The texture of those camp experiences translated into prose that carried the immediacy of lived truth. Readers would not just understand his theories, they would feel them at the level of cellular recognition. In lectures that began tentatively in small Vienna halls, Frankl discovered something remarkable happening. Audiences, individuals who had never experienced concentration camps, who lived in circumstances of relative comfort and safety, were recognizing themselves in his observations. The principles of logotherapy spoke to a universal human condition, the search for meaning in a world that often seemed meaningless. The sound of applause after his first major presentation carried emotional frequencies he had never heard before. This was not polite academic acknowledgement, but the recognition of profound truth. People approached him afterward with tears in their eyes, describing how his insights had illuminated their own struggles with purpose, depression, and the challenge of living meaningfully in difficult circumstances. Medical conferences began requesting his presence. Universities extended invitations. But Frankl understood that his real laboratory had been those barracks, those selection lines, those moments when human nature revealed its deepest capacities. The theories emerging from his typewriter were not abstract concepts. They were survival tools tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Publishers initially hesitated. The manuscript challenged conventional thinking about psychology, about suffering, about human resilience. But when the first edition of Man's Search for Meaning appeared in 1946, something unprecedented occurred. Readers didn't just read it, they were transformed by it. Letters poured in from around the world, from executives in crisis, from individuals facing terminal illness, from anyone struggling to find purpose in suffering. The book's impact grew beyond anything Frankl had imagined. Translations appeared in dozens of languages. Medical schools began incorporating logotherapy into their curricula. But perhaps most importantly, individuals who had lost their sense of purpose began finding their way back to meaning through principles forged in humanity's darkest hour. Standing in his rebuilt Vienna office, Frankl could hear the city's pulse returning to normal rhythms. Church bells rang again. Children played in streets that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Life was regenerating itself through the simple, magnificent act of continuing to believe in meaning despite evidence to the contrary. But his greatest revelation was still ahead. The discovery that his experiences, as terrible as they had been, had equipped him to offer humanity something it desperately needed, proof that meaning could not only survive anything, but could transform everything. The best is yet to come.
The young woman across from Viktor Frankl's desk wept quietly, her hands trembling as she described a life that felt empty despite every external marker of success. The year was 1975, 30 years after liberation, and similar scenes played out in his Vienna office nearly every day. But what happened next would demonstrate how meaning, once forged in history's darkest crucible, could illuminate even the most privileged forms of suffering. "Tell me," Frankl said gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about despair. "What would you regret most if your life ended today?" The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. Through the window, Vienna hummed with prosperity, its cafes full of animated conversation, its streets alive with purpose. Yet here sat another human being, experiencing the same existential vacuum Frankl had identified decades earlier in these very rooms. The transformation that followed was not dramatic, no Hollywood moment of sudden revelation. Instead, it unfolded like dawn breaking, gradual but inexorable. Over subsequent sessions, the woman began to discover that her depression stemmed not from any external circumstance, but from the absence of personal meaning. Through logotherapy, she identified her unique contribution to the world, mentoring young professionals who struggled with the same emptiness that had consumed her. This scene, repeated thousands of times across Frankl's later career, represented the ultimate form of moral justice. The suffering he had endured, the loss of family, home, health, and nearly life itself, had been transformed into a healing force that reached across cultures, languages, and circumstances. The very experiences that might have broken him had become the foundation for humanity's deeper understanding of resilience. Man's search for meaning had evolved beyond a book into a phenomenon. By the 1970s, it had been translated into dozens of languages, selling millions of copies worldwide. But more importantly, it had become a practical toolkit for anyone facing life's inevitable suffering. Cancer patients used Frankl's insights to find meaning in their battle with disease. Business executives discovered purpose beyond profit. Parents grieving the loss of children found ways to honor their memory through service to others. The letters that arrived at Frankl's office told stories that would have seemed impossible during those dark nights in Auschwitz. A prisoner in solitary confinement had reconstructed his will to live using principles from the book. A surgeon had found renewed purpose in her work after reading about responsibility as humanity's fundamental drive. A Holocaust survivor's daughter had broken free from inherited trauma by choosing to find meaning in preserving her parents' story. In universities around the world, logotherapy programs emerged like flowers pushing through concrete. The Third Vienna School of Psychotherapy, as Frankl's approach became known, offered an alternative to both Freudian analysis and behavioral modification. It proposed something revolutionary: that humans were not merely products of their unconscious drives or conditioned responses,
but meaning-seeking beings capable of transcending any circumstance through the power of purpose. The irony was profound and healing. The Nazi regime had sought to prove that humans were nothing more than animals, reducible to basic survival instincts when stripped of civilization's veneer. Instead, Frankl's observations from within their death camps proved the opposite, that humans possessed an irreducible spiritual core that could not be touched by external circumstances. This core, the capacity to choose one's attitude toward unavoidable suffering, represented humanity's most distinctive characteristic. Standing before audiences at Harvard, Oxford, Stanford, Frankl would often pause at the moment when he described the selection process at Auschwitz. The auditoriums would fall silent, hundreds of privileged students and professors confronting the reality that their comfortable lives were built on the same foundation he had discovered in extremity: the choice to find meaning regardless of circumstances. But perhaps the most powerful validation of his work came from unexpected sources. Military psychologists began using logotherapy with combat veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress. The principles that had sustained Frankl through concentration camps proved equally effective for soldiers processing the moral injuries of war. Addiction counselors discovered that patients who found personal meaning in recovery showed dramatically higher success rates than those focused solely on symptom management. The sound of his grandchildren's laughter in the garden outside his study reminded Frankl daily of life's capacity for renewal. These voices, playing where once only silence seemed possible, represented the ultimate triumph over those who had sought to end not just individual lives, but the very possibility of future joy. Every child's laugh was an act of defiance against despair. Every family dinner a victory over the forces that had tried to make human connection impossible. As the 1990s approached, Frankl could see his work's true scope. Logotherapy had become more than a therapeutic approach. It had evolved into a philosophy of human dignity that spoke to the universal condition. In corporate boardrooms and cancer wards, in classrooms and courtrooms, people were discovering that the question was not, "Why is this happening to me?" but rather, "How can I find meaning in what is happening to me?" The manuscript that had begun as academic theory, been destroyed by hatred, then reconstructed through suffering, had ultimately become a testament to humanity's most extraordinary capacity, the ability to transform the worst that can happen to us into the best we can offer others. Standing in his Vienna office for the last time before retirement, Viktor Frankl understood that his suffering had been redeemed, not through revenge or bitterness, but through meaning. The camps had taken everything from him, but in return had given him something even more valuable: the knowledge that nothing could take away the human capacity to choose purpose over despair, meaning over meaninglessness, hope over hatred. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most profound examples of human resilience. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who might need to hear that meaning can be found in any circumstance. Subscribe and ring the notification bell to continue exploring stories of individuals who found purpose in the face of impossible odds. What stories of resilience and meaning would you like to explore next? Perhaps the remarkable journey of Helen Keller, who transformed disability into advocacy, or the inspiring path of Nelson Mandela, who chose reconciliation over revenge. Share your suggestions in the comments. Your voices guide our next expedition into the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit. Next, we uncover another life where meaning rose from the ruins.